Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us again. We've got Sheila Logan from the UN Environment Program. Today, again, thank you, Sheila, for joining us again to present on the reduction of emissions of mercury from large point sources controlled under the Minamata Convention. This webinar is presented by the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution and, of course, the UN Environment. Sheila has been working with UNEP for 13 years on issues relating to chemicals and waste, and she is known as the queen of UNEP there for the Minamata Convention. Her work on chemicals and waste has built on her previous work at the Department of Health and Aged Care in Australia, where she worked as a regulatory toxicologist assessing pesticides and industrial chemicals. She is an expert also in veterinary medicine and surgery and has her degree there from the University of Melbourne. So Sheila, thank you so much for joining us again, and all who are listening now. Sheila also presented a while back on mercury as well. So we will be compiling all of our mercury info sessions for you to be all in one place so that you can learn more about the toxicology of mercury, artisanal gold mining in mercury, this presentation now on large point sources, and other info sessions as we move forward. So thank you so much, Sheila, and I present it over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to host another session here and talk about one of the major issues of mercury, and that's the reduction of the emissions of mercury from large point sources. We're working in the Minamata Convention on mercury, and I won't go into too much of the history, but just to highlight some key dates. The convention entered into force in August this year, in 2017, and then the first meeting of the Conference of the Parties was held in Switzerland, in Geneva here, at the end of September this year. The convention was developed to address the global problem of mercury, and one of the key elements around mercury issues is that emissions of mercury are transported long range. They go globally around the world, so that the emissions of mercury which may occur in the US or in China or in Europe don't necessarily impact directly the countries where they're emitted, but may be transported to other areas, to other regions of the world. The last global mercury assessment, which was published in 2013, found that at this point, artisanal and small-scale gold mining had moved to be the most major of the sources. But at the previous assessments and previous considerations, coal combustion had always had the leading role as contributions to mercury entering the environment. If you look at these top sources of mercury emissions, you'll see that a number of them, the coal combustion, the non-ferrous metals, and the cement production, are all addressed under the convention, and there are specific controls on the emissions of mercury from these sources. The fifth major source, because coal combustion is actually split into two sources under the convention, the fifth source is waste incineration facilities. It doesn't actually hit in these top list, but it's so ubiquitous, with many, many countries relying on incineration of waste as a disposal means, that it's also included and regulated under the convention. So as I said, there are 5 source categories covered under the convention. Coal-fired power plants are the first listed, then coal-fired industrial boilers, smelting and roasting processes used in the production of non-ferrous metals. And for the convention, the non-ferrous metals controlled are lead, zinc, copper, and industrial gold. For these sources, it's only the smelting and roasting processes that are considered. Any mercury releases resulting from extraction processes do not get covered under this emissions article. Then waste incineration facilities are specifically controlled, and then finally cement clinker production facilities are controlled. So you can see here a nice picture of a smelter, and just highlighting, of course, that it's the smelting and roasting in non-ferrous metals that are actually the controlled sources. When we look at waste incineration, the controls under the convention refer specifically to waste incineration facilities. And we look at a number of different subcategories within this. Medical waste is one of the sources that contributes quite a lot of mercury. Medical waste is incinerated many places because it deals with the other hazards associated with medical waste. You can deal with infection, you can deal with other contaminations, but of course you occasionally do have actual pure mercury in medical waste from things like broken thermometers. Then the second subcategory we list here is municipal waste, normal household waste, and many things here contain mercury. You can, even in the best waste separation systems, have some inclusion of mercury added products in municipal waste, but we also need to remember that all substances may contain certain amounts of mercury. You open a tin of tuna, the tuna itself will have mercury in it, so there can be some mercury residual in the can. If that goes to waste incineration, then that mercury is available for release. Hazardous waste is also incinerated. Normally these facilities do have some additional levels of controls, but in some places those controls are minimal. And so we need to look at regulating the controls of mercury releases from mercury emissions from these sources. And then there's sewage sludge, which is incinerated in some areas as a method of disposal, and you need to control and regulate the emissions of mercury from that. Within these 5-point sources, these are the sources which parties to the convention are required to control. However, in looking at these relevant sources, there is one part of the controls which will help parties out a little bit. Within the convention, there's an option that you may not need to control absolutely all sources within a category, but you do have to make sure that for any of these categories, you include at least 75% of the emissions from this category. So you put in place your control measures to catch most of the mercury. And this is assistance for countries which may have very widely spread sources. You may have, for example, a small industrial boiler, or a boiler which is classed as being industrial size. Perhaps it's servicing a school or a hospital, but it's only just over what you'd call industrial rather than non-industrial. And if it's been there for a long time, you may not want to come in and retrofit a lot of controls if you consider that it's only actually going to be present for another few years and then it will be taken out of service. So there is this possibility for a party to identify exactly which of the sources they will control, as long as they're capturing 75% of the emissions. And there is guidance on these measures, on how to do this, on how to choose, that it was adopted by the Conference of the Parties at its first meeting in September. So that guidance is available for all parties and governments intending to be parties to use as they plan what controls they need. And here are some of the things you may consider, which is set out in that guidance. You may look at the size of the facilities and not control very small facilities. As I'd already indicated, the expected life of the facility, where the facility is. Some facilities are quite remote and importing control technology may be challenging for them. And you may already also look, the final one, at any pollution control measures which are already in place at the facility. You may consider this gives you sufficient control of the mercury emissions so that you don't need to put in place additional controls. Under Article 8 and under the obligations in the Convention, there are different obligations for new sources and for existing sources. New sources are defined in the Convention as sources which are constructed or substantially modified, with the work commencing at least 1 year after the date of entry into force of the Convention for the parties. So at the moment, we're in a grace year. The Convention entered in force on the 16th of August. And so you could commence building a new power plant now, and it would not be defined as a new source under the Convention. It would then classify as an existing source, even though you're just building it. Now, for new sources, controls are stricter under the Convention, and these controls have to be applied within 5 years of the Convention entering into force for that particular party. And the requirement here is that you must use best available techniques or best environmental practices, or you must use emission limit values that are consistent with such techniques. So you may decide that the controls you do are good, and you can just measure your emissions and prove to yourself and to others if needed that your emissions are consistent with what you'd get if you definitely applied best available techniques. One of the big works that's been undertaken between the time that the convention was open for signature in 2013 and the final meeting of the INC process, INC 7, which was held last year, was the development of guidance on best available techniques and best environmental practices. And this guidance has been published and is available on the website. It's now been formally adopted by the Conference of the Parties. And to make this document available on our website, we've split it into a number of separate documents for ease of access, ease of use, and ease of download. And the documents are, there's an introduction which talks about some of the principles, how you apply BAT-BEP, what is BAT-BEP, why we're doing this for Mercury, what other controls may be relevant, and other relevant conventions. Then there's a section on common techniques which apply across the different source categories. There's a section on monitoring, and then there are specific substance-based chapters. So there is a chapter on coal-fired power plants and coal-fired industrial boilers. These are treated together because the problems and the solutions are very, very similar for all of them. Smelting, the non-ferrous metals, smelting and roasting processes, a chapter on waste incineration, a chapter on cement clinker production facilities. And then there's a separate chapter which looks at new and emerging techniques that have been identified. And including techniques in this, the experts were very careful to only consider techniques and only include techniques where there's a level of data that supports the use of the technique on an industrial level. There are many experimental techniques which people are developing and which are only just at the beginning of testing. And because there's no good data on how these perform on an industrial level, they haven't at this stage been included in the guidance. So the next few slides just run through what some of the contents are. So I've already talked briefly about what some of the introductory sections are. I think it's very important to consider one I didn't mention is the cross-media effects. One of the concerns that people have when you're looking at capturing emissions of mercury is that you'll simply divert where that mercury enters the environment. So it's considered very important by the group of experts developing the guidance that this should be prevented as far as possible. So if you have, for example, fly ash from capturing mercury, that this should be dealt with in an environmentally sound way. It shouldn't just be dumped in the environment, for example. Turning more briefly, but in more detail than previously, onto monitoring. The monitoring techniques here reference techniques which are currently in use. So if you're looking through the guidance, you'll see that there's a lot of references to existing work in the EU, in the US, for example, and some in Canada, where companies and facilities are required to do a level of monitoring. And so there's very good data on how well the monitoring techniques work. In addition to this general chapter on monitoring, there are specific monitoring advice related to each individual section, because different industries have put different requirements on themselves and have different capabilities. And sometimes monitoring which works well in one type of environment doesn't necessarily work well elsewhere. Turning to existing sources, the convention does require controls of existing sources. And this looks at sources which you may have coal burning power plants which have been there for many, many years. Some of these facilities are quite old. Some of them may have very poor controls applying to them. And parties were concerned as they were negotiating the convention about the costs of running in and putting in new controls on these facilities. And in recognition of that, there is quite a range of sources that you can apply to existing facilities. There's also a reasonable phase-in date that you're expected to control your facilities within 10 years of date of entry into force of the convention for you as a party. If you look at the control options, the first of these is to establish a quantified goal. The second is to apply emission limit values for controlling and, where feasible, reducing emissions. Then you have the option of using best available techniques, best environmental practices. You can consider multi-pollutant control strategies that deliver co-benefits for a range of mercury emissions. And then you may look at alternative reduction measures. Many countries who are already working on air quality issues are actually in the position where they are already applying some of the multi-pollutant control strategies. For example, controls on particulate matter have good benefits for mercury, because much of the mercury which is being emitted from facilities is emitted in association with particulate matter. So you may find when you evaluate your facilities that you are already controlling for mercury, although you haven't done specific mercury controls. The use of emission limit values can be very useful in certain situations, because you may find that you have a fortunate source of coal. Some coal is actually very low in mercury, and you don't actually get significant mercury emissions from facilities burning that type of coal. If you test your coal, you test your emissions, you may find that you actually have quite good mercury levels with minimal controls, and you may be able to at that point justify that you don't need additional controls. We often get caught up in chasing the last 2%, chasing the last 5%, and it is sometimes you look at it realistically to say we're better off cleaning up a much bigger problem rather than chasing that last 5%, depending on where you are in national development, depending on where you are with other priorities, for example. This area of implementing measures for existing sources is another area where the convention requires guidance to be developed by the COP, and the guidance was adopted formally at the first meeting of the Conference of the Parties. And this sets out how you might go about these different aspects. So looking at how you set emission limit values, and do you set it at a facility basis, for example? Do you look at it on a regional or a national basis? To look at how you may set a quantified goal for controlling and, where feasible, reducing emissions. Do you set a facility goal, or do you set a goal that applies across all of your sources? You also look at what some of the alternative measures to reduce emissions from relevant sources. One of the most successful ways to reduce emissions from certain sources is actually to close the facility. And this has been a technique applied in a number of countries where they've turned around and said, we have a number of small facilities which are old, they're not particularly efficient. So what we'll actually do is consolidate that activity. We'll close the old facilities and we'll only run with more modern, more efficient facilities, and that will reduce our emissions overall in this particular time period. For a number of reasons, there's obligations under the Convention for developing inventories. And the requirement for developing inventories under the Convention is that it's to be done no later than 5 years after the date of entry into force of the Convention. There's an obligation that you have to maintain your inventory. And if you look at it, this is very key for most countries in looking at regulating their emissions. The first inventory will demonstrate to you the extent of the problem and identify where your efforts best need to be applied. Further inventories will allow you to monitor the progress. There's an obligation in the Convention that your measures should achieve reasonable progress in reducing emissions over time. And the inventory and the maintenance of that inventory is the way that you as a party can track that progress, and you can demonstrate to other countries that you are actually making progress. The expert group also developed guidance on the methodology for preparing inventories, and this looks at a number of steps. Many countries are actually already undertaking their initial inventories as part of their preparation for ratification or their preparation for implementation after becoming a party. So the first step is to plan how you will develop the emissions inventory. You'll need to consider how you'll collect, handle and review data, including any quality control and quality assurance. You need to look at how deep you're going to go into the collection and verification of data. Are you going to do a desk study? Are you going to do individual monitoring, for example? And this is a party decision as to how you develop your inventory. But of course, the more clear and precise your data is, the better you're able to use it in controlling facilities and in monitoring progress. Lots of the information, because these are big facilities, there's lots of information that you can actually gather as a first step in a desk study, because these facilities are usually registered. They may pay taxes, they have employees, they will have an online presence as well as a physical presence. So gathering that information can be a very good start. Then you have the opportunity to review all of your sources within the source category and determine which ones you'll consider relevant and whether there's any that you would exclude from the controls. Countries can choose to look at how each facility will be based on reporting. So this reporting could be on a number of ways. We looked at reporting on how much coal did you burn last year is one way of reporting. How much power did you generate, for example? How much mercury did you emit if you actually monitored? Then you need to look at collecting the emission reports from facilities, and this should be done periodically. And for many countries, they will probably plan to do this annually as part of the overall review of facilities. Then, as part of your inventory, you really should develop a database to store the reported emissions data. Emissions data of any kind is great, but if it sits on a shelf in paper copy in someone's office, it doesn't help anybody. So you need to be able to access and analyze that information. Then again, you need to look at how you facilitate analysis of results and how you do this in terms of preparation and publication of the results. And then the recommendation is in the guidance is that you make the data publicly accessible and searchable. So this allows the public to get information about facilities which may be in their region, to look at information about what pollutants are coming out into the environment. And this is already done by many countries as part of pollution release and transfer registers. So it's not a new proposal, but it's certainly something we consider very useful for Mercury. When we look at the reporting you do, there is a new reporting structure, which was also adopted at the first meeting of the COP. And under this structure, there are reporting obligations in relation to the emissions. The COP agreed on both the structure of the reporting document, which will be published as a decision of the Conference of the Parties, but also on a timing of the reporting. And they've agreed that for most of the articles of the convention, including the emissions article, it will be a 4-year cycle of reporting. And the first report is due at the end of 2021. For certain articles under the convention, they've actually implemented a shorter reporting period of a 2-year cycle, with the first report due in 2019. But this refers to aspects of trade in mercury and also in waste processing of mercury. So it doesn't affect the emissions reporting. The emissions is only on the 4-year cycle. The data that's reported to the COP on your emissions will assist the COP, of course, in assessing the effectiveness of the convention, because countries' data on how effective their controls are on emissions will help in looking at how effective the convention is overall. So this is an important aspect for the convention. Now, we look at, there's a number of resources which are available, and these are in the slides that you can use the link. So we have a UNEP Global Mercury Assessment. This looks like sources and emissions and releases of mercury. The current version was published in 2013. There is a new version which will be published next year in 2018, and that will give us, it's anticipated that those two versions, the 13 and the 18, will be a little more comparable, because we've worked with a lot of experts to get a assessment methodology that people are happy with, and so there'll be an opportunity to see some of the trends. UNEP has a toolkit for the identification and quantification of mercury releases, and that's releases to all environmental areas, so air, water, soil, etc. And that toolkit is a way of doing a good fairly quick assessment at the level 1 toolkit to see exactly what your emissions are, where they might be, etc. And then you can do a more detailed analysis which looks at actually getting data on much more individual level and looking at monitoring data, etc., to get you a much more focused consideration of the emissions within your country. Then the last document there mentioned there is the UNEP process optimization guidance, and that's specifically directed at coal-fired power plants, and it looks at how you can best adjust your process overall to minimize your emissions of mercury. And these also can be read in conjunction with the guidance adopted by the COP, so the guidance on BAP-BEP, the guidance on selecting relevant sources, the guidance on implementing controls on existing sources, and the guidance on inventory development. So that concludes the formal part of the presentation. You can contact us, the Minamata Convention of Mercury. At the moment, we're still using mercury.chemicals@unep.org. And of course, you can follow us on Twitter at Minamata, MEA. And finally, if you have any follow-up questions to me, feel free to contact me. My email has changed. For some of you, you'll notice it's different. It's now at un.org rather than unep.org, but my phone number remains the same, and I'll be happy to be contacted for any questions or comments that you may have. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Sheila. Thank you so much. That was very informative. I have a couple of follow-up questions on my end, but I also wanted to thank you specifically for pointing out that controlling for mercury may also control for component air pollution and vice versa. I think these co-benefits need to be further highlighted, especially for politicians who are worried about, how do I implement all of these things that all these different treaties are calling for? And here's, okay, if you do this under here, you're going to have a co-benefit over there, I think is really important. And related to that, I wonder if there's been any reports that have come out regarding that. That's my first question.
Sorry, regarding
the co-benefits for controlling for mercury and, say, air pollution.
Yep. We have seen some data. We know there's quite a lot of data in relation to particulate matter control, so the general air quality, black carbon sort of issue. When we were developing the BAP-BEP guidance, there were a lot of people there who had also worked on the Stockholm Convention and the POPs controls, and there is a lot of similarity. There is one point where you do have to weigh up the co-benefits between mercury and POPs, and that is that one of the methods you have for improving mercury capture is actually to inject bromine or chlorine into the gas stream. And this runs a potential risk of increasing some of your POPs production, but that's been balanced in the guidance as to how to suggest to do it best. There is a document that's been published jointly by the UNEP Global Mercury Partnership area on coal combustion and people working on climate change, because that is one area where, while there are co-benefits in some areas, there are potential conflicts in that introduction of control technologies does tend to slightly reduce the efficiency of a power plant. So you do have to weigh up that aspect, in that if you reduce the efficiency a bit to capture the mercury, how much effect are you having on your climate change effects? Of course, move to alternative energy sources and you actually control both quite nicely, but you do need to weigh up some of those aspects. But it is interesting, if you look, we do have figures on how much mercury is associated with particulate matter, and have been able to demonstrate for some countries who have been concerned about how are we going to afford to control mercury. You can look at what their particulate matter reduction are and saying, well, you've already controlled for mercury. You've already taken big steps. If you didn't have those particulate matter controls in place, your emissions would have been this much higher. And we've done that on an individual country basis for a couple of countries.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. That's very helpful. And it would be good for us to be able to point anyone who's got questions about those documents to Sheila and the website if you have it posted later. The second question I have is related to the inventory process, and specifically, is there now a model for this so that countries don't have to start from scratch? And I'm sure that UNEP is assisting with this process. Could you just talk a little bit more about that and how countries can
Yeah.
access it?
Yeah. So UNEP developed quite early in the Mercury days an inventory toolkit, and this toolkit has been used and refined and further developed over time. Now, the guidance that's been developed by the group of experts references the toolkit, but it takes care to point out that this isn't the only way to do inventories. And this is primarily because many of the developed countries actually use their own processes, and they use processes which are perhaps more detailed than is accessible to a lot of countries around the world. However, most of the countries who are currently undertaking Minamata initial assessments as part of the process of preparing for implementation have been using the Mercury inventory toolkit. So it is accessible and available, and people have experience with using this. The toolkit's now available as an online tool, and there's links to that tool from our website, the Mercury Convention website. With the online tool, it guides you through the process of developing an inventory, and this is much broader than an emissions inventory. This is an inventory looking at mercury across all sectors of your economy, and areas that are controlled by the convention, areas that aren't necessarily controlled by the convention. And the online version of the toolkit has some very, very useful features. For example, for each country, based on the size and gross domestic product, there are some understandings about what we might expect the mercury emissions to be. In the online version of the toolkit, if you enter a figure which seems fundamentally wrong to our expectations, it actually flashes that up for you and asks you to really think about and confirm whether this is the right number or not. And we did this because in the early days of emissions, we did have some countries developing an inventory, and because they were sending it around to different ministries, getting input from different people, we had some inventories that had an order of magnitude problem. Somebody had read the form and thought it said tons, and actually it was asking in that particular aspect for kilograms.
Oof, yeah.
So that's a big difference in the number.
Mhm.
With the online version of the toolkit, if you thought it said kilograms and it actually meant ton, and you put in 10,000 because you know it's somewhere around 10 tons, it would flash up and say, do you really mean this? So that's very useful for countries. We have done a lot of training on the use of the toolkit, and the training is ongoing with implementing agencies. The GEF is on the initial assessments. So there are quite a lot of countries who are well advanced in that process, and many of them are moving from the desk level inventory toolkit to a more detailed one. You can also choose, you don't have to do the more detailed inventory on all aspects of your country. So you may choose that you do a detailed inventory, for example, on waste facilities or on waste generation, because you're making big efforts there and you want to track real progress. So you look at moving to the more detailed inventory to track those things. So it's certainly there, it's available for use, and that's available from the Mercury website at mercuryconvention.org.
Okay, great. That's really useful to know that there's a lot of tools out there and that are available for countries. So it seems like if you're a country looking to deal with their mercury emissions, there's a lot to do, and this inventory process will help countries be able to prioritize where their largest sources are to prevent and control. Um, how could you speak a little bit more about the inventory process in terms of how does it really help you prioritize where to actually implement solutions in terms of, say, for human health impacts, or is it more focused on just really where the largest emissions are as a whole?
I think you can apply it at the national level as you best see fit. The inventory is as good as the effort you put into it in many senses. And I've seen countries use it to highlight specific issues of health concerns. So one of the things some countries have specifically focused on, for example, is the use of mercury in skin lightening cream. And through developing their inventory, they've looked at the fact that they have a major problem with the use of skin lightening creams containing mercury, and looked at the different aspects that this has, because it has a direct human health impact on the people using the creams. It also has a big impact on the environment, because when people shower or wash, the mercury that was in the cream, some of that will go into the sewage system or go into whatever wastewater disposal you have. And then you also have the waste issue of the discarded tubes. So in those countries, they did a particular survey and focus on that. Another aspect is, if you're looking at the general inventory levels, you may use it as part of your process for identifying contaminated sites, and then considering the location of contaminated sites and using that to prioritize what methods of controls you need to do. When you look at the industrial facilities and look at the inventories there, people are generally aware where their facilities are, because coal-fired power plants are fairly obvious. You can't really hide them. But the inventory will help to look at determining, okay, exactly how much of an impact is this having? And with our location, is it such that we're likely to get impacts on local waterways through local deposition of mercury? And do we need to look at the levels of mercury in those waterways to see, do we have another public health issue there with consumption of contaminated fish? Unfortunately, I think some countries have the potential to use their mercury inventory more as a desk exercise and more as a, we really need to do this. But I'm hoping that most countries will use it as a way to identify priorities, identify gaps, and to really find out more about their national mercury issues and work on how to address them. I think we've got great teams in the implementing agencies working on this with countries and working to make progress to really tackle the mercury issue at the ground level. Thank you.
Great, Sheila. Thank you so much. Does anyone else have any other questions?
No, not at the moment.
Okay.
Great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sheila. And we will be posting this webinar on our GAP YouTube channel. Sheila will be available for questions, as she mentioned earlier, and we will continue to host these webinars just about once a month moving forward. So thank you again, Sheila. It's been a pleasure, especially to have you present twice on such a hot topic. And again, congratulations on the entry of force of the convention this year. It's really a fantastic achievement for all the countries and agencies involved.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure as always.